Some shows get nervous about controversy. South Park has spent almost 30 years walking straight into it. It has mocked a religion so directly that the people behind it received actual death threats. It has built an entire season around a single word that most networks will not even let actors whisper. It has turned a school principal into a walking parody of campus activism, then had him beat a child nearly to death over a single phrase. It has been banned in entire countries. It has been edited, blacked out, and quietly erased from its own archive. And through every single one of these moments, the creators have insisted on one thing: that nothing is off limits, and that the loudest voices demanding silence are usually the ones most worth examining. Tonight, over the next 2 hours, we are walking slowly through the long and surprisingly consistent war this show has waged against political correctness, episode by episode, decade by decade. Welcome to East Park. Let's get started. The town that refused to apologize. Long before South Park became a cultural institution, it was something much smaller and much stranger. In the mid-1990s, Trey Parker and Matt Stone were two film students in Colorado with a video camera, a stack of construction paper, and almost no money. They made a short film as a joke, a Christmas card sent to a television executive, featuring crude cutout figures of Jesus Christ and Santa Claus, arguing over who really owned the holiday. The short was never meant for broadcast. It was meant to make a small group of industry friends laugh. Instead, it was copied, passed around, and eventually became one of the first viral videos in the history of the internet, years before anyone used that word. That short film mattered because it set the tone for everything that came after it. The joke was not subtle. It was not softened. It took two of the most protected figures in Western culture, a religious icon and a beloved children's character, and put them in a physical fight over money and ownership. Nobody asked permission. Nobody worried about who might be offended. The entire premise was built on the assumption that nothing, no matter how sacred, was beyond being examined, mocked, or turned into a punchline. It is worth sitting with how unusual this was at the time. Animation aimed at adults barely existed as a category. The closest comparisons were a handful of late-night sketch shows and one or two primetime cartoons that pushed boundaries occasionally, but always within recognizable limits. There was an unspoken understanding that cartoons, even crude ones, eventually had to land somewhere safe. The Christmas card short did not land anywhere safe. It simply ended mid-argument, with neither figure winning and neither figure being punished for the fight itself. There was no moral. There was no resolution. There was just two iconic characters behaving badly, drawn in a style that looked like it had been made by a child with scissors and glue. When Comedy Central eventually picked up the show for a full series, that same instinct carried over directly into the first episode. Cartman Gets an Anal Probe aired on August 13th, 1997, and it set expectations for the next 3 decades almost by accident. The episode follows 4 boys waiting for the school bus, one of whom, Eric Cartman, describes a dream about being abducted by aliens and subjected to a humiliating physical examination. Within the first few minutes, the show establishes its core cast, introduces its most famous running gag with the death of Kenny McCormick, and does so using language and imagery that most animated shows at the time would never have considered. What made the episode notable was not just its content, but its method. The animation itself was created using paper cutout figures, physically moved and photographed frame by frame, a technique borrowed directly from those early Christmas card shorts. The show looked rough on purpose. It looked like something made by people who did not care whether it looked professional. That visual roughness became part of the message. This was not a polished product trying to appeal to everyone. It was something closer to a dare, daring the audience to either turn it off or keep watching. There is a detail in that first episode that often gets overlooked. The boys do not just witness something strange and move on the way characters in a more conventional show might. They argue about it. They disagree about what is real and what is not. Cartman insists his experience was just a dream, while the others are convinced something genuinely happened to him, and the show lets that disagreement sit unresolved for most of the episode. Even in its roughest, earliest form, South Park was already comfortable with ambiguity, with characters who did not agree with each other and were not required to reach consensus by the end of 22 minutes. That comfort with disagreement would later become one of the show's most defining traits. Sources covering the show's early history describe this period as part of a much larger cultural moment. The mid to late 1990s in the United States were defined by what many called the culture wars, a period of intense disagreement over what was acceptable to say, joke about, or depict on television. Talk shows were being criticized for being too crude. Music was being labeled for explicit content. Movies were facing new rating scrutiny. Into this environment, South Park arrived not as a show that ignored these tensions, but as one that seemed to actively feed on them. The humor in that first episode came directly from the collision between innocence and crudeness. These were children, drawn simply, with high-pitched voices and small, round bodies, and they were saying and experiencing experiencing things that no children's show would ever allow. The show was not pretending the contrast did not exist. The contrast was the joke. A small boy describing an alien abduction in graphic detail is funny specifically because children are supposed to be protected from exactly that kind of content. South Park took that protective instinct and treated it as something to be poked at, repeatedly, episode after episode. This is the foundation that everything in this video sits on top of. Before there was a PC principle, before there was a banned episode about a religious figure, before there was a fraternity of politically correct enforcers terrorizing a fictional town, there was a basic creative philosophy. Nothing is sacred enough to be left alone, and the discomfort that comes from breaking a taboo is not a flaw in the joke, it is the joke. That philosophy did not stay static. As the show grew from a crude novelty into a long-running series with real cultural influence, the targets shifted. The early seasons mocked celebrities, religious institutions, and broad social taboos with a kind of scattershot energy, throwing punches in every direction without much concern for whether those punches added up to anything larger. But underneath that scattershot energy, a pattern was already forming. Time and again, the show found its richest material not in the taboo subjects themselves, but in the reactions to those subjects, the outrage, the demands for apology, the insistence that certain things simply could not be said or shown. This shift happened gradually enough that it was easy to miss while it was happening. An episode might begin as a straightforward parody of a celebrity or a current event, the kind of joke that could have aired on any number of shows at the time, but somewhere in the middle, the focus would quietly turn. The celebrity would stop being the point. The actual subject of the episode would become the wave of reaction that followed, the news coverage, the public statements, the demands that something be pulled or apologized for. South Park was, almost without announcing it, becoming a show about response as much as a show about content. This is where the show's long relationship with political correctness truly begins, not as a single storyline or a single character, but as a recurring observation. Parker and Stone seemed to notice early on that the people trying to police language and content were often more interesting and more revealing than the content itself. A joke about a sensitive topic might get a laugh and then be forgotten, but the response to that joke, the letters, the protests, the calls for boycotts, often said something much larger about the culture making those demands. By the time the show reached its later seasons, this observation had hardened into something close to a thesis. South Park increasingly positioned itself not as a show that simply broke rules, but as a show that examined the people making the rules. The targets of its satire began to include activists, administrators, and institutions whose stated goal was protection, sensitivity, and inclusion. The show did not argue that these goals were wrong in themselves. What it argued, again and again, often without saying so directly, was that the methods used to achieve those goals frequently became more harmful than the problems they claimed to solve. That argument did not appear out of nowhere in season 19 with the introduction of PC Principle, even though that character became its most famous expression. The groundwork had been laid more than a decade earlier, in episodes that took direct aim at forced tolerance, performative outrage, and the growing sense that certain words and ideas were becoming untouchable regardless of context or intent. Understanding those earlier episodes is essential to understanding why PC Principle landed the way he did when he finally arrived. He was not a new idea. He was the culmination of an argument the show had been building since its earliest seasons, just given a face, a uniform, and a fraternity house. It also helps to understand what the show was not doing during this period, because the absence of something can be just as telling as its presence. South Park rarely, if ever, framed its targets as villains in any traditional sense. The activists, the administrators, the outraged callers and protesters who appeared across these early seasons were almost never given a moment of pure malice. They believed, in the world of the show, that they were doing the right thing. That belief was treated as completely sincere. The joke was never that these characters were evil. The joke was that their sincerity, taken to its logical end, produced results that were absurd, harmful, or both. This distinction matters enormously for everything that follows in this video, because it explains why the show's targets so often feel uncomfortably familiar rather than cartoonish. What makes this history worth examining slowly is that South Park's relationship with political correctness was never simple agreement or simple opposition. The show has spent years mocking people who claim to be defenders of marginalized groups, while also, in other episodes, treating those same groups with a surprising amount of care and nuance. It has criticized cancel culture while also participating in moments that, by any modern standard, would themselves be considered deeply offensive. This contradiction is not a flaw in the show's argument. It may actually be the argument itself, the idea that consistency is less important than honesty, and that a show willing to offend everyone equally has a kind of credibility that more careful careful, more calculated comedy cannot match. In the sections that follow, this video will move chronologically and topically through the moments that built this reputation. From a satirical concentration camp built to mock forced tolerance, to a single racial slur repeated dozens of times in a single episode, to a religious figure so carefully avoided that an entire episode was blacked out before it could air a second time, to the arrival of an enforcer character so extreme that he beat a 10-year-old boy nearly unconscious for using the wrong word. Each of these moments tells part of a larger story, and that story is still being written today, more than 25 years after a crude paper cutout video first showed two iconic figures fighting over Christmas. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That early refusal to soften anything set the tone for everything that came after. The next chapter takes that same defiance and points it directly at one of the most loaded words in the English language, in an episode that used a Schindler's List parody to mock the very idea of forced tolerance. Section 2. The Tolerance Camp. By the time South Park reached its 6th season, the show had already built a reputation for taking on subjects that other programs avoided entirely. But the Death Camp of Tolerance, which aired in November of 2002, did something slightly different. Rather than mocking a single taboo subject directly, it turned its attention toward the institutions and people who positioned themselves as defenders of tolerance, and it did so using one of the most carefully chosen visual references the show had ever attempted. The episode centers on Mr. Garrison, the boys' teacher, who has been promoted to teach the 4th grade class at South Park Elementary. Garrison, a character the show had long used to explore questions of identity and acceptance, comes up with a plan. He wants to be fired. Specifically, he wants to be fired for being openly and aggressively homosexual in front of his students, because he believes a wrongful termination lawsuit based on his sexuality could net him a massive financial settlement. The plan requires him to be as flamboyant and explicit as possible in the classroom, hoping that the school will have no choice but to let him go. The joke, on its surface, seems like it should be straightforward. A teacher behaving inappropriately should get fired, but the show immediately complicates this expectation. Rather than firing Garrison, the school administration, the other teachers, and even the children's own parents go out of their way to demonstrate how accepting and tolerant they are. No matter how extreme Garrison's behavior becomes, the adults around him respond with exaggerated approval, treating his behavior not as something to be addressed, but as something to be celebrated as an example of diversity. This is where the episode's real target comes into focus. The boys themselves, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, are the only characters who react to Garrison's behavior the way an actual classroom of children might, with confusion, discomfort, and complaints. And for expressing that discomfort, they are punished. Not by Garrison directly, but by the system around him, a system that has decided their reactions are unacceptable regardless of context. The punishment the boys receive is where the episode makes its most striking choice. They are sent away to a facility described as a tolerance camp, a place designed to re-educate children who have shown insufficient acceptance of diversity, and the moment they arrive, the show makes a visual decision that would have been unthinkable in almost any other context. The screen shifts entirely to black and white. The lighting, the framing, the staging of the camp itself, all of it is constructed as a direct visual reference to Schindler's List, the 1993 film about the Holocaust. This is worth pausing on, because the choice is not subtle, and it was clearly not accidental. The episode does not simply gesture vaguely at the concept of a camp. It recreates specific visual elements associated with one of the most solemn and widely respected films ever made about one of history's greatest atrocities, and it applies those elements to a story about children being sent away for failing to applaud a teacher's behavior loudly enough. The contrast between the visual weight of the reference and the triviality of the children's actual offense is the entire point. Sources describing the episode have noted that this comparison was meant to function as exaggeration rather than equivalence. The episode is not arguing that mandatory tolerance training is the same as genocide. What it is arguing, through the deliberate mismatch between the visual language and the actual stakes, is that the impulse to forcibly correct people's attitudes, even when done in the name of a good cause, carries an authoritarian shape that should make people uncomfortable regardless of the cause behind it. The black and white camp sequences are funny specifically because they are so disproportionate. But the disproportion is the argument. The episode is asking viewers to notice how easily the language and structure of moral correction can scale up, even when the underlying goal sounds reasonable. Inside the camp, the boys are subjected to lessons and chants designed to instill tolerance through repetition and pressure, rather than through genuine persuasion. They are not given an argument for why their reactions to Garrison were wrong. They are simply told over and over that they must change how they feel, and that their feelings themselves are the problem to be fixed. The episode treats this as a kind of brainwashing. Regardless regardless of how well-intentioned the camp's stated mission might be. Meanwhile, back in South Park, Garrison's plan continues to fail in increasingly absurd ways. The more outrageous his behavior becomes, the more the adults around him insist on framing it as something to be admired. At one point, the situation escalates to the point where a lawsuit does eventually happen, but not in the direction Garrison expected. The episode's plot resolves through a court case that the show uses to comment directly on the legal mechanisms surrounding discrimination claims, mechanisms that the episode portrays as having become so reflexive that they can be triggered by almost anything, regardless of whether genuine harm has occurred. What makes the death camp of tolerance particularly important to the larger story this video is telling is how clearly it establishes a structure the show would return to again and again in the years that followed. The structure works like this. A character or institution claims to be acting in the name of tolerance, acceptance, or sensitivity. That claim is treated as completely sincere within the world of the show, but the methods used to enforce that claim become increasingly coercive, increasingly disconnected from the actual people they are supposed to be protecting, and increasingly absurd the longer they are allowed to continue unchecked. The episode also introduces something else that would become important later. It draws a distinction between two different things that often get treated as the same. One is genuine tolerance, the kind that involves actually living alongside people who are different and extending them basic respect. The other is performative tolerance, the kind that involves loudly demonstrating approval in order to avoid being seen as intolerant, regardless of whether that approval is sincere or whether it actually serves the person it is supposedly directed at. The adults in this episode are never shown engaging with Garrison as a person. They are shown performing reactions to him, reactions calibrated entirely around how those reactions will be perceived by others. This distinction matters because it reappears in different forms throughout the rest of South Park's history with this subject. The PC fraternity that would not arrive until more than a decade later operates on a very similar logic. Its members are not shown caring about the people they claim to be protecting in any individual, personal sense. What they care about is the performance of caring, the visible display of correct attitudes, enforced through whatever means necessary. The death camp of tolerance is, in many ways, a rough draft of an argument the show would spend years refining. It is also worth noting how the episode treats Garrison himself throughout all of this. He is not punished by the show for being gay, and the episode does not treat his sexuality as the joke. The joke is entirely about his attempt to weaponize the system's reaction to his sexuality for personal financial gain, and about how the system's reaction becomes so predictable and so performative that it can be exploited in the first place. Garrison's actual identity is almost incidental to the episode's argument. What the episode cares about is the machinery of institutional response, and how that machinery behaves when it encounters something it has been trained to treat as untouchable. By the end of the episode, the boys return from the tolerance camp having learned the lesson the camp intended to teach, but the show frames their return with a kind of weariness rather than triumph. They have not been persuaded, they have been processed. The episode does not pretend that this kind of correction produces genuine belief, it produces compliance, and the show treats the difference between those two things as significant, even if none of the adult characters in the episode seem to notice or care about that difference themselves. Looking back at this episode from more than 2 decades later, what stands out most is how early it arrived relative to the cultural conversations it now seems to anticipate. Terms like performative allyship and virtue signaling would not become common in everyday language for many more years. But the structure the death camp of tolerance identifies, the gap between visible approval and genuine engagement, the way institutional responses can become more about appearance than substance, the authoritarian potential hiding inside well-intentioned correction, all of these ideas are present here, more than 10 years before PC Principal would walk into South Park Elementary and give that structure a face, a uniform, and a fraternity house full of like-minded enforcers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The tolerance camp showed what happens when institutions perform acceptance instead of practicing it. The next chapter looks at what happens when that same institutional discomfort gets pointed at a single word, one used more than 40 times in a single episode, and the surprising response that followed. Section 3, the word nobody could say. By March of 2007, South Park had been on the air for more than a decade, and the show had already built a reputation for tackling subjects that most television avoided. But with apologies to Jesse Jackson, the season 11 premiere took on something that even South Park had largely left alone until that point. The episode centers on a single racial slur, the most loaded word in the English language, and it builds its entire story around the consequences of that word being spoken on national television. The episode opens with Randy Marsh, Stan's father, appearing as a contestant on a game show modeled closely after Wheel of Fortune. Randy makes it to the bonus round, and the category story for his final puzzle is people who annoy you. He is given a handful of letters, enough to make the answer mostly clear, but he hesitates. He seems to sense that the word forming in front of him is dangerous, that saying it out loud on live television would be a serious mistake. And then, after a long pause that the show lets sit uncomfortably, he says it anyway. He uses the slur fully and clearly in front of a national audience, with his family watching from the studio and the entire town watching from home. What happens next is the actual subject of the episode. Randy does not get away with a quiet apology and a quick return to normal life. The reaction is immediate and overwhelming. He becomes a national figure of controversy, literally overnight. People recognize him in public. He is banned from local businesses. He cannot walk down the street without being confronted. At one point, he is even chased by a group of people, specifically because of what he said. People who frame their own anger as a response to racism, even as their methods become increasingly aggressive and personal. Sources covering the episode have noted that this storyline was directly inspired by a real incident that had occurred just a few months before the episode aired. A well-known comedian, during a live stand-up performance, had responded to hecklers by repeatedly shouting the same slur at them, an outburst that was filmed, distributed widely, and became a major news story. The comedian later attempted to repair the damage by appearing on a radio program hosted by a prominent civil rights figure, where he offered a public apology. That sequence of events, the outburst, the backlash, and the public apology to a specific figure positioned as a kind of moral authority, maps almost exactly onto the structure of the South Park episode. In the world of the episode, Randy's path to redemption runs through a character based on Jesse Jackson himself. Randy travels to Jackson's office seeking forgiveness, hoping that securing an apology from this one specific person will make the controversy go away. What he receives instead is a moment the show plays for both comedy and discomfort at the same time. Jackson, in the episode, accepts the apology only after Randy performs a deeply humiliating physical act, and a photograph of that moment becomes the new headline, replacing the story of Randy's offense with a story about his punishment. The episode does not let this resolution feel like a real resolution, though. Randy returns home believing the matter is settled, since he has now apologized to the person the world seems to consider the appropriate authority on the subject. But back at school, Stan is confronted with a much more complicated reality. His best friend Token, the only black student in their class, has not forgotten what Randy said, and does not consider an apology to a celebrity figure in another city to have any bearing on how he personally feels about it. This is where the episode does something that surprised many people who expected it to simply be another shock value premise. Stan spends much of the episode trying to convince Token that the situation is not a big deal, that his father is not actually racist, just careless, and that everyone should be able to move past it. Token's response, delivered without anger but with clear firmness, is that Stan does not get to decide how big a deal it is, because Stan has never had that word used against him, and never will in the way Token has. The line lands because it does not fit the pattern the episode seems to have been building toward. Up until that point, the show has been mocking the public's reaction to Randy, the chasing, the banning, the celebrity apology tour, all of it played as absurd overcorrection. But Token's objection is not part of that absurdity. It is treated by the episode as simply correct. Stan does not have a counter-argument. He cannot explain away what his father said, and by the end of the episode, he is forced to admit to himself and to Token that he does not actually understand what the word means to someone it has historically been used against, and that his attempts to smooth things over were more about his own comfort than about Token's experience. Running alongside this main story is a subplot involving Cartman and a substitute teacher who happens to have a form of dwarfism. The school brings this teacher in specifically to discuss sensitivity with the students as part of the broader response to Randy's outburst. Cartman, predictably, treats the substitute with open disrespect, at one point referring to him using language that strips away his humanity entirely. The substitute eventually challenges Cartman to a physical confrontation, which goes about as well as most physical confrontations involving Cartman tend to go, ending with the substitute storming off after declaring that he has proven his point, even though none of the children present seem to understand what that point was supposed to be. This subplot exists in direct contrast to the main story, and the contrast is deliberate. The substitute teacher's approach to addressing prejudice, confrontation, lecturing, demonstrations of moral authority produces nothing. Cartman is unaffected. The other students are confused. Nothing about anyone's actual attitude changes as a result of the lesson. Meanwhile, the main story's resolution comes not through any official program or lesson, but through one specific person being honest with another about how a specific word made him feel, in a conversation that nobody organized and no institution oversaw. According to reporting on the episode's reception, the response from at least one major civil rights organization was notably positive, with the knock reportedly describing the episode as a useful example of of educating the public about the power of hate language and its impact on individuals. This response stood in contrast to what some might have expected from an episode that used the slur itself dozens of times throughout its runtime. The episode was not condemned as an example of the word being used carelessly. It was, in some corners, praised as an example of the word being examined honestly. At the same time, not everyone read the episode the same way. Some viewers came away from With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, sympathizing primarily with Randy, viewing him as a man who made an honest mistake and then suffered consequences that seemed disproportionate to that mistake. From this perspective, the episode's portrayal of the public's reaction, the banning, the chasing, the demand for a public apology to a specific figure, reads less like satire of an overcorrection and more like a sympathetic portrait of someone being punished unfairly for a moment of carelessness. This reading exists in tension with the episode's other major thread, the one involving Stan and Token, which treats the word's impact as real and serious rather than as an overreaction. The episode does not resolve this tension, and it is worth asking whether it was ever trying to. Throughout its run, South Park has rarely offered viewers a single, tidy takeaway, preferring instead to present multiple perspectives side by side and trust the audience to sit with the discomfort of holding them at the same time. With Apologies to Jesse Jackson asks viewers to feel two things that do not fit together easily: that the public reaction to Randy's mistake was excessive, performative, and at times more about punishment than understanding, and also that Token's hurt was completely legitimate, and that Stan's attempts to minimize it were a failure on Stan's part, not an overreaction on Token's. Looking at this episode in the context of everything else covered in this video, it occupies an unusual position. It is, in some ways, the most direct confrontation with a single taboo word that the show had attempted up to that point, more direct even than the religious satire that would generate far more lasting controversy, and yet its actual message is more careful than its premise might suggest. It is not an episode that argues words do not matter, nor is it an episode that argues the public response to those words is always correct. It is an episode that separates those two questions entirely, treating the word's power as real while treating the performance of responding to that word as something that can become its own kind of problem. This separation between the seriousness of an issue and the seriousness of the response to that issue is something this video will return to repeatedly. It is, in many ways, the underlying tension running through almost everything South Park has done with political correctness over the years. The show rarely argues that the underlying concerns are imaginary. What it argues, again and again, is that the systems built to address those concerns often stop serving the people they were meant to help and start serving something else entirely: the appearance of having responded, regardless of whether anything was actually resolved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This episode showed that South Park could handle its most dangerous subject with more care than its premise suggested. The next chapter covers a moment where that same willingness to confront a taboo subject went further than almost any television show ever had, and led to consequences the creators never fully recovered from. Section 4. The episode that vanished. Of every controversy this video has covered so far, none compares to what happened in the spring of 2010 when South Park aired a two-part story that would change the show forever. The episodes were called 200 and 201, named for their place in the show's overall episode count, and they were designed from the start as a celebration. The plan was to bring back nearly every celebrity the show had ever mocked across 200 episodes, gathering them together in one massive storyline as a kind of victory lap. What actually happened turned that celebration into one of the most significant moments in the history of television censorship, and it remains, to this day, an episode that cannot be legally viewed through any official channel. To understand why this happened, it helps to look back at where the conflict actually began. Several years earlier, in an episode that addressed the global controversy surrounding cartoon depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, South Park had attempted to include an image of Muhammad as part of its commentary on the subject. At the time, the network responsible for broadcasting the show made a decision that was unusual even by the standards of television censorship. Rather than allowing the image to air, the network replaced it with a black screen and a message explaining that the image had been blocked. The episode aired anyway, jokes intact, but with this one specific element removed entirely from view. This decision became its own kind of story. The act of censoring the image generated more conversation than the image itself likely would have. News outlets covered the decision. Commentators debated whether the network had made the right call. The censorship became, in a strange way, more newsworthy than the satire it was covering up. For Parker and Stone, this created an opportunity they could not resist. If the act of censoring a joke about Muhammad had become bigger news than the joke itself, then an episode specifically about that censorship, about the absurdity of an image being being too dangerous to show, even in cartoon form, seemed like fertile ground for exactly the kind of satire the show had built its reputation on. 200 set up this premise carefully and slowly, in a way that gave the episode time to breathe before it reached its central idea. The episode brought back a celebrity character the show had used for years as a recurring target, a character whose presence had itself generated lawsuits and complaints in the past. This character, furious about years of mockery, assembles a group of other previously mocked celebrities and threatens the town of South Park unless the town can produce something that this group desperately wants, something they believe will protect them from further ridicule. That something turns out to be connected to Muhammad, who, within the show's own internal mythology, is depicted as one of several religious figures who possess a kind of protective power, a power that comes specifically from never being shown or mocked directly. This framing device was itself a clever piece of writing, the kind of layered satire the show had become known for by this point in its run. The episode was not simply saying that Muhammad could not be depicted, it was building an entire internal logic around that fact, treating the inability to depict him as a kind of supernatural shield, something other figures in the show's universe might want to acquire for themselves. The joke worked on two levels at once. On the surface, it was a story about a group of vengeful celebrities trying to steal a magical power. Underneath that surface, it was a direct commentary on the fact that one specific figure existed completely outside the rules that governed every other target the show had ever used, no matter how famous, how powerful, or how litigious those other targets had been in the past. The plot of 200 ends with the town's leaders attempting to bring Muhammad to South Park in order to meet this demand, setting up the second episode, 201, to deal with the actual fallout of that attempt. And it is here that the story moves from the world of the show into the real world, in a way that almost nothing else in the show's history has matched. Before 201 even aired, word of its premise had spread. A group calling itself Revolution Muslim, based in New York, issued a public statement in response to the planned episode. According to reporting at the time, this statement did not simply criticize the show or call for a boycott, which would have placed it within the same category as nearly every other controversy this video has discussed. Instead, the statement referenced the 2004 murder of a Dutch filmmaker who had made a film critical of the treatment of women in some interpretations of Islam, a filmmaker who was killed shortly after that film's release in an act that shocked much of Europe. The statement suggested that Parker and Stone could face a similar fate, and it reportedly included information about where the show's production studio was located, language that many observers read as something close to an explicit threat rather than a warning or criticism. This was not a typical controversy. Every other moment covered in this video, no matter how heated, existed within the world of public debate. People wrote letters, people organized boycotts, people called for apologies, for bans, for changes to future episodes. All of these responses, however intense, were responses that operated within a shared assumption that the disagreement, however serious, was fundamentally about ideas, about what should or should not be said, shown, or joked about. The response to 201 broke that assumption completely. This was, by any reasonable definition, a direct reference to violence against the creators of a television show, made in response to content that had not yet even aired, and made by referencing a real act of violence that had already happened to someone else under closely related circumstances. The network's response, when 201 finally aired, was extensive, and it went well beyond what had happened with the earlier episode. Every depiction of Muhammad in the episode was blacked out entirely, similar to the earlier censorship but more thorough and more visible throughout the runtime. Every mention of his name was bleeped from the audio, removing not just images but also words, so that entire sentences became partially unintelligible wherever his name would have appeared. And in a decision that drew significant attention on its own, the network also altered a speech given by Kyle at the end of the episode, a speech that, in earlier episodes, had often served as a kind of moral summary, the moment where the show's underlying point was stated directly to the audience in plain terms. This speech was also censored, its audio replaced or muted, even though sources have noted that the speech itself did not actually reference Muhammad at all. The censorship, in this case, appeared to extend beyond just the specific threat into a broader caution that affected content seemingly unrelated to the original concern. This detail has been discussed at length by people analyzing the episode in the years since, because it represents something different from censoring an image or a name. It represents a kind of preemptive caution applied so broadly that even the show's own attempt to explain its point in its own voice, through its own characters, was deemed too risky to allow through unaltered. The episodes aired in this heavily altered form, and then something even more unusual happened. Both episodes were pulled from circulation entirely. They were removed from streaming platforms that otherwise carried the show's complete catalog without interruption. They were excluded from from later home media releases in their original form, with later season box sets containing only the censored versions rather than the episodes as they were originally written and produced. For a show that had built its entire identity around never backing down, around treating every subject as fair game, regardless of who objected or how loudly, this represented something the show had never experienced before, a complete and lasting retreat, not by choice, but by circumstance. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant for the show's creators specifically, and for the larger argument this video has been building across the previous sections. Throughout this video, we have discussed episodes where South Park mocked sensitive subjects and then dealt with public criticism, viewer complaints, organized boycotts, and cultural debate. All of those responses, no matter how intense, existed within a framework where the show could continue operating, continue making episodes, continue engaging with the same subjects again later if it chose to. A celebrity could be mocked one season and mocked again the next, regardless of how angry that celebrity had been the first time. A religious or cultural practice could generate complaints, and the show could simply continue, sometimes returning to the same subject from a different angle in a later episode entirely. The response to 201 existed outside that framework entirely. This was not a debate about whether a joke had gone too far in terms of taste, the kind of debate that could be settled, eventually, through public conversation, apology, or simply the passage of time. This was a situation where continuing to engage with the subject in the same way carried a real and specific physical risk to real people, a risk that did not diminish over time the way public outrage often does. There was no audience to satisfy, no institution whose approval needed to be earned, no boycott that could be waited out. There was simply a threat, and a network deciding how to respond to that threat in the most cautious way available, a decision that, once made, has effectively remained in place ever since. What makes this story particularly significant for the larger argument of this video is how it reframes everything that came before it. Up until this point, South Park's relationship with controversy had always operated under an implicit assumption that the worst outcome of pushing too far was backlash, criticism, maybe a temporary ban in a specific country, but ultimately survivable consequences that the show could absorb and move past, often turning the backlash itself into material for a future episode. The 201 situation introduced a different kind of outcome entirely, one where the content itself became permanently unavailable, not because anyone decided through debate or ratings or complaints that it was wrong, but because the risk of making it available again was considered too high to justify, regardless of what anyone actually thought about the content on its merits. This created an unusual asymmetry that the show has never fully resolved, and that remains true today, many years later. South Park has, in the years since 201, continued to address an enormous range of subjects that other shows would avoid entirely. Politicians, religious figures, celebrities, social movements, technology companies, all of these have continued to appear as targets of the show's satire, often in ways that generate significant controversy of their own, controversy that the show has, in many cases, gone on to address directly in later episodes, treating the controversy itself as new material. But the specific subject at the center of 201 has remained largely untouched in the years since, not because the show's creators have expressed any change of heart about whether the subject should be open to satire in principle, but because the practical reality of the threat that followed the original attempt has not gone away in any meaningful sense. This raises a question that sits at the center of this video's larger argument about political correctness, and it is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. Is the absence of further jokes about this specific subject an example of political correctness winning, of a sensitive topic becoming successfully off limits through social and institutional pressure, the exact kind of outcome the show has spent decades arguing against in other contexts? Or is it something categorically different, a recognition of a credible threat of violence that exists independently of any debate about sensitivity, correctness, or institutional overreach, the kind of threat that any reasonable person or organization would take seriously regardless of their views on satire? The show itself has never fully answered this question, at least not directly, and the ambiguity is part of what makes the 201 situation so different from everything else covered in this video. In every other section of this script, we have looked at situations where the show's creators made a deliberate choice about how to handle a sensitive subject, choices that reflected their own judgment about where the line should be drawn and why. The 201 situation is different because it removes that judgment from the equation almost entirely. The decision was not made by Parker and Stone weighing the merits of a joke. It was made, in large part, by a network responding to a threat that had nothing to do with the joke's quality, its intent, or its place within the show's larger satirical project. There is also a broader irony embedded in how this entire situation unfolded, one that sources covering the story have noted repeatedly in the years since. The episodes that triggered this response were not, in their original intent, primarily about the religious figure at their center. They were about censorship itself, about the absurdity of one subject existing completely outside the normal rules of satire that governed every other target the show had ever used. The episodes were, in a very real sense, a celebration of the show's own history of refusing to treat anything as untouchable, built around the one exception to that rule. And the response to those episodes ended up proving the exact point the episodes were trying to make, while simultaneously ensuring that the point could never be made again in the same way. This is not a story with a tidy resolution, and this video will not pretend otherwise. Unlike many of the other controversies covered here, where the passage of time eventually allowed for reflection, reassessment, or even a kind of grudging respect from former critics, the 201 situation has simply remained as it was. The episodes exist, but cannot be legally accessed through official channels. The subject remains one that the show, by all available evidence, continues to avoid, not out of agreement with the idea that it should be avoided, but out of a practical reality that has not changed in the years since. For the purposes of this video, the significance of 201 lies less in what it says about the specific subject at its center, and more in what it reveals about the limits of the show's own framework for handling controversy. Every other episode covered in this video operates within a world where pushing back against political correctness, against institutional caution, against the impulse to declare certain subjects off limits, is something the show can do repeatedly, absorbing whatever consequences follow, and often turning those consequences into future material. 201 represents the one place where that pattern broke down completely, where the consequences were not something the show could absorb and move past, but something that became permanent, woven into the show's history, as a kind of boundary that even South Park, for all its willingness to offend, has not crossed again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This episode showed that there was at least one line the show could not cross again, not by choice, but by circumstance. The next chapter steps back to an earlier era, looking at how the show mocked outrage culture and performative offense years before those terms became part of everyday language. Section 5. Crab People and Crybaby. By the early 2000s, South Park had been on the air long enough to start developing what might be called a signature move, a way of structuring an episode that would become instantly recognizable to longtime viewers. The pattern usually went something like this. A character does something small, often something so minor it would barely register in real life. That small action then gets noticed by someone else, and that someone else reacts to it not with a small response, but with an enormous one, treating the original action as evidence of something much larger and much worse than it actually was. From there, the reaction itself becomes the story, spreading through the town, escalating with each retelling, until the original action is almost completely forgotten, and the only thing left is the outrage itself, feeding on its own momentum. This pattern appears across several episodes from this era, and looking at them together reveals something important about how the show was thinking about political correctness years before that specific phrase became a common part of everyday conversation. These episodes were not, for the most part, framed as direct commentary on any particular political movement or ideology. They were framed as observations about human behavior, about how groups of people respond when given a reason to be offended, and about how quickly that response can become disconnected from whatever triggered it in the first place. One of the clearest examples of this pattern comes from an episode often remembered today primarily for a single recurring joke that became unexpectedly popular among fans, even though the episode's creators themselves were famously unhappy with how that particular element turned out. The episode follows a trend that begins after a popular television show about men receiving makeovers starts airing in South Park. Following the example set by this show, men across town begin adopting more polished, more groomed, more deliberately styled appearances and mannerisms, embracing trends that had previously been associated almost exclusively with a very different audience. What makes this episode relevant to the larger argument of this video is not the makeover trend itself, but how the show handles the reaction to it. As more and more men in town begin adopting this new style, a kind of panic starts to spread, driven by characters who become convinced that this shift represents something dangerous, something that needs to be stopped before it spreads any further. The response to a relatively harmless cultural trend, men paying more attention to their appearance, becomes wildly disproportionate, eventually escalating into a conflict that involves characters literally going to war over what amounts to a disagreement about grooming habits and personal style. The episode introduces, almost as an afterthought, a group of strange crab-like creatures living outside of town, creatures that exist seemingly without any purpose connected to the main plot at all. According to sources discussing the episode's production, the creators themselves were not happy with how this element came together, viewing it as one of the weaker ideas the show had ever produced. most. And yet, in the years since the episode aired, these creatures became one of the most fondly remembered and frequently referenced elements from this entire stretch of the show's history, appearing in later episodes and becoming a kind of shorthand reference among longtime fans. This disconnect between the creator's own assessment of the episode and how audiences responded to it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it illustrates something that applies more broadly to how South Park has been received over the years. The show's creators have, at various points, expressed surprise or even discomfort at which elements of their work ended up resonating most strongly with audiences. Jokes intended as throwaway moments became iconic. Episodes intended as the show's strongest statements sometimes generated less lasting impact than smaller, stranger ideas that the writers themselves considered minor. This unpredictability is part of what makes South Park difficult to analyze as a single coherent statement. The show is not always in full control of what it ends up being remembered for, and the gap between intention and reception runs through almost every era of its history. Another episode from this same general period takes a more direct approach to the subject of performative offense, focusing on a national controversy involving a popular musical duo and a televised event. The episode follows the town's reaction after a similar incident occurs locally, an incident involving a wardrobe malfunction during a school performance. What follows is a town-wide reaction that escalates far beyond anything the actual incident would seem to warrant, with characters expressing outrage not necessarily because they were personally offended, but because expressing outrage had itself become the expected response, a kind of social performance that everyone felt obligated to participate in regardless of their actual feeling. This episode is particularly interesting because it does not frame the outrage as coming from any single ideological direction. The characters expressing the strongest reactions are not coded as belonging to any particular political group. They are simply townspeople, ordinary residents of South Park, responding to a minor incident with a level of moral indignation that seems to exist independently of the incident itself. The outrage becomes a kind of currency, something people perform in order to demonstrate their own values to others, regardless of whether they actually feel the emotions they are displaying. This observation, that performative offense can function as a kind of social currency, something exchanged between people as a way of signaling values rather than expressing genuine feeling, runs through several episodes from this era in different forms. Another episode follows a controversy involving a children's television program, one that the boys had grown up watching, after that program is suddenly pulled from the air following accusations that it contains hidden messages or imagery considered inappropriate. The episode follows the boys as they investigate this controversy, uncovering layer after layer of claims and counterclaims, each one seemingly more absurd than the last, until the original question of whether the program actually contained anything problematic becomes almost impossible to answer, buried under competing narratives from people who, in many cases, had clearly never watched the program at all. This episode in particular captures something that would become increasingly relevant in the years that followed: the way that controversies can take on a life of their own, generating commentary, debate, and even formal responses from institutions, all based on claims that may have only a loose connection to whatever the original source material actually contained. The boys, investigating the controversy from the ground up, find themselves constantly running into people who have strong opinions about the program, but who, when pressed, reveal that their opinions are based entirely on what they have heard other people say, rather than on anything they have actually seen or experienced themselves. What ties all of these episodes together, despite their very different premises, is a shared interest in the mechanics of how reactions spread, independent of whatever they are reactions to. South Park, in this era, seemed less interested in arguing about whether any particular thing was actually offensive, and more interested in observing what happens to a town, a community, a culture, once the question of whether something is offensive becomes less important than the question of whether people are willing to say it is offensive, loudly, publicly, and in a way that other people can see. This distinction matters enormously for understanding the show's later, more direct engagement with political correctness as a specific term and a specific set of behaviors. By the time PC Principle arrives in the show's 19th season, the show is no longer simply observing this pattern from a distance, the way it does in these earlier episodes. It is putting a face on it, giving it a uniform, a fraternity, a specific ideology, and a specific set of enforcement mechanism. But the underlying observation that performative reactions can become more powerful and more consequential than whatever they are reacting to is not new in season 19. It has been present in the show's writing for over a decade by that point, expressed through smaller, stranger, more localized stories about wardrobe malfunctions, canceled cartoons, and men adopting new grooming habits. There is also something worth noting about how these episodes treat the people caught up in these reactions. Unlike some of the show's later, more pointed satire, these earlier episodes tend not to single out specific groups or ideologies as the source of the problem. The outrage in these episodes comes from everyone, spreads through everyone, and implicates everyone, including characters who, in other episodes, might be positioned on opposite sides of a debate. This even-handedness is part of what gave these episodes their staying power. They were not episodes that asked viewers to agree with one side against another. They were episodes that asked viewers to recognize a pattern of behavior that exists across groups, across ideologies, across time, a pattern that has less to do with any specific belief system and more to do with how communities behave once they discover that being offended, or appearing to be offended, can itself become a source of social power. Looking back at this era from the perspective of everything that came later, what stands out is how much groundwork these episodes laid without ever needing to use the specific language that would later become associated with these ideas. There is no character in these episodes who identifies as politically correct, no institution that frames its actions in terms of sensitivity or inclusion in the way later episodes would make explicit. And yet the underlying behaviors, the disproportionate reactions, the performance of offense as social signaling, the way controversies detach from their original source and take on independent life are all present, fully formed, years before the show would give these behaviors a name and a uniform. This is, in many ways, the quiet middle chapter of the story this video is telling. It does not contain the show's most famous controversies, and it does not contain the moments that generated the most lasting consequences for the show itself, but it contains something arguably more important for understanding everything else: the underlying observation that the show would spend the rest of its run elaborating on, refining, and eventually personifying in the form of a character whose entire existence is built around exactly the behaviors these earlier episodes had already identified, years before he ever walked through the doors of South Park Elementary. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. These early episodes showed a pattern of reaction spreading faster and further than whatever caused it, without ever needing a name for that pattern. The next chapter is where that pattern finally gets a name, a uniform, and a fraternity house, when a new principal arrives at South Park Elementary and changes the show completely. Section 6. The fraternity takes over. For 18 seasons, South Park Elementary had one principal. Principal Victoria had been a fixture of the show since its earliest years, a relatively minor character compared to the boys themselves, but a consistent presence. The person who ran the school, dealt with the parents, and occasionally appeared in storylines involving the staff. When the show's 19th season premiered in September of 2015, all of that changed within the first few minutes of the very first episode. The episode, titled Stunning and Brave, opens with an announcement to the parents and students of South Park Elementary. Principal Victoria has been fired. The reason given is connected to an incident involving a student using an extremely offensive phrase to describe a serious crime, a phrase that Victoria allegedly failed to adequately address. In her place, the school board has appointed a new principal, a large, muscular man who introduces himself with an energy that immediately separates him from every previous authority figure the show had ever portrayed. This new principal, who becomes known throughout the season simply as PC Principal, arrives with a clear mission. He has been brought in specifically to address what the school board apparently views as a culture of racism and unconscious bias among the students and staff of South Park Elementary. His introduction to the school is framed almost like the arrival of a celebrity, with an energy and presentation that borrows heavily from the world of college fraternities and gym culture, an aesthetic that immediately signals something the show would spend the rest of the season developing in detail. Sources describing this character have noted that he represents something genuinely new in the show's history, a satirical target built specifically around the figure that, by 2015, had become widely known in online discourse as a social justice warrior, though PC Principal himself never uses that exact term. Instead, the show builds his identity around a different cultural reference point entirely, one that initially seems almost unrelated to questions of social justice or political correctness at all. PC Principal looks, talks, and behaves like a fraternity brother. He wears the kind of athletic wear associated with college sports culture. He speaks with the casual, aggressive confidence of someone used to being the loudest person in the room. He uses slang and mannerisms borrowed directly from frat house culture, the same culture that, in other contexts, might be associated with exactly the kind of behavior PC Principal claims to be fighting against. This combination, the language and aesthetics of progressive activism, layered on top of the swagger and aggression of fraternity culture, is the core joke that defines the character. And it is worth taking time to understand why this combination works as satire, rather than simply as a strange creative choice. The joke is not that PC Principal's stated goals, addressing racism, addressing bias, making the school a more inclusive place, are inherently bad goals. The joke is is that the way he pursues these goals looks identical to the way a stereotypical aggressive frat bro might pursue completely different goals. Dominance, status, the enforcement of group norms through intimidation and peer pressure. PC Principal has not actually changed the underlying behavior pattern at all. He has simply redirected it toward a new target. This becomes clear almost immediately in the episode's plot. After his introduction, PC Principal does not spend his time having thoughtful conversations with students about bias or having productive discussions about language. Instead, he and a group of like-minded adults, including several of the boys' own fathers, form what is explicitly described as a fraternity, moving into a shared house together and adopting fraternity naming conventions for their group. The name they choose for this fraternity is constructed from two Greek letters that, when written out, visually resemble the letters P and C, a detail that several sources have pointed out as a clever piece of visual wordplay underlying the entire premise. The boys themselves react to PC Principal's arrival with a mixture of confusion and fear, and one storyline in particular illustrates how the show chose to demonstrate the character's defining trait, his combination of ideological mission and physical violence. Cartman, true to form, attempts to cause trouble for the new principal almost immediately, hatching a scheme that involves trying to frame him using a fabricated accusation. The scheme fails almost instantly, not because PC Principal sees through it cleverly, but because Cartman, in the course of trying to set up his scheme, uses a word that PC Principal considers a trigger, a word that, in any other context, might be considered relatively mild. What follows is one of the most genuinely shocking sequences the show had produced in years. PC Principal does not lecture Cartman. He does not send him to detention or call his parents. He attacks him, physically and violently, in a school bathroom, with a level of brutality that the show does not soften or play primarily for laughs in the way it might have handled similar violence in earlier seasons. The attack is severe enough that Cartman's injuries remain visible for the rest of the episode, a detail that sources have noted as unusual, since the show's characters typically recover from cartoonish injuries instantly, with no lasting visual consequences. This sequence establishes, in the clearest possible terms, the central contradiction that defines PC Principal as a character, and that the show would spend the rest of the season exploring. He has been brought in specifically to reduce harm, to make the school a safer and more inclusive place, to address a culture that the school board apparently believed was causing real damage to students, and his primary method for achieving this goal is to cause severe physical harm to a student, triggered not by any genuinely racist statement, but by a word that, heard in a different context, would barely register as offensive at all. The episode's title itself, Stunning and Brave, comes from another storyline running parallel to the main plot, one involving a real-world figure who had become a major topic of public conversation around the time the episode was written, a figure whose transition had been covered extensively by media outlets using language that some commentators felt was excessive or performative in its praise. In the world of the episode, this figure visits South Park, and the adults of the town respond by repeatedly describing her using the exact phrase that gives the episode its title, regardless of context, regardless of whether the situation actually calls for that kind of language. The boys, watching the adults around them repeat this phrase over and over in situations where it clearly does not fit, begin to notice something the adults themselves seem unable to see. The phrase has stopped functioning as a genuine expression of admiration and has instead become a kind of mandatory verbal tick, something people say not because they mean it in any given moment, but because not saying it carries social risk. When one of the boys, in a moment of simple honesty, suggests that maybe this particular figure is not actually the most stunning and brave person he has ever encountered, simply because he does not personally know enough about her to make that judgment, the response from PC Principal is immediate and severe. This moment is significant because it connects the episode's two storylines, the arrival of PC Principal and the town-wide obsession with a specific phrase, into a single coherent argument. PC Principal is not simply a violent enforcer of progressive language. He is the enforcement mechanism for an entire culture that has decided certain phrases must be repeated regardless of their actual meaning in a given context, and that failing to repeat those phrases, even for reasons that have nothing to do with genuine prejudice, constitutes an offense serious enough to warrant punishment. By the end of the episode, the consequences of this new culture have become clear. The boy who questioned the phrase, having refused to back down even after being threatened, finds himself isolated, ostracized, and ultimately broken by the pressure placed on him, not just by PC Principal directly, but by the surrounding adults, and even his own peers, all of whom have absorbed the new expectations and begun enforcing them on each other without needing PC Principal to do it for them. The episode ends not with PC Principal being defeated or even challenged in any meaningful way, but with the town having fully adapted to his presence, having internalized his expectations so completely that his explicit enforcement is no longer even necessary. This ending matters enormously for understanding what the show was doing with this character across the rest of the season. PC Principal himself appears in relatively few scenes throughout Season 19, compared to how central he becomes to the season's overall theme. What the season actually tracks is not PC Principal's actions specifically, but the spread of the culture he represents. A culture that, once introduced, does not require constant enforcement because it becomes self-sustaining, maintained by people who have learned what is expected of them and who now enforce those expectations on each other, often more aggressively than PC Principal himself ever does directly. Sources discussing the reception of this character and this season have described a range of reactions, with some commentators praising the show for what they saw as an incisive critique of a real cultural phenomenon, identifying something true about how certain forms of activism can become more about performance and enforcement than about the underlying causes they claim to represent. Other commentators read the season differently, viewing it as an oversimplified caricature that flattened a complex set of social movements into a single violent frat bro stereotype, missing the actual substance of the concerns those movements were raising. What both readings tend to agree on, however, is that PC Principal represented a turning point in how the show approached this subject. Everything covered in the earlier sections of this video, the tolerance camp, the episode about a single word, the earlier episodes about performative outrage, all of these dealt with the subject through specific, isolated stories, each one self-contained, each one making its point and then moving on. Season 19 did something different. It built an entire season around a single recurring antagonist, one whose presence shaped every episode that followed, creating a sustained argument rather than a series of separate observations. This shift towards serialization was itself somewhat unusual for the show, which had historically favored standalone episodes over connected storylines. The decision to build an entire season around PC Principal and around the broader culture his arrival represented suggests that by 2015, the show's creators felt that this subject had grown large enough and consistent enough to warrant a different kind of treatment than the isolated episodes of earlier seasons. The fraternity, once formed, does not simply appear in one episode and disappear. It becomes a fixture of the town, its members appearing throughout the season, its influence spreading into institutions and relationships that had nothing to do with the school in earlier episodes. By the end of this first episode, the show has established everything it needs for the rest of the season to build on. A new authority figure, defined by the contradiction between his stated mission and his actual methods. A town that has already begun adapting to his presence, often faster and more thoroughly than he required. And a phrase, stunning and brave, that has come to represent everything the season is interested in. Language that has been emptied of its original meaning and repurposed as a kind of social password, one that everyone is expected to use, regardless of whether they understand or even agree with what it originally meant. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. PC Principal's arrival showed how quickly a town can absorb a new set of rules without anyone needing to enforce them directly. The next chapter looks at what happens when that same town tries to protect its most fragile members from criticism entirely, and the character introduced specifically to push back against that idea. Section 7, The Safe Space 5. Episodes into South Park's 19th season, the show turned its attention to a subject that had, by 2015, become deeply tied to conversations about social media, self-esteem, and the growing influence of online validation in everyday life. The episode, titled Safe Space, takes its name from a term that had become increasingly common in discussions about college campuses and workplaces, a term used to describe environments specifically designed to protect people from criticism, harassment, or content they might find upsetting. The episode's central storyline follows Cartman, who, in a development that surprises several of the other characters, becomes the target of body shaming after gaining weight. What makes this storyline interesting from the start is the way it inverts a dynamic the show had used for years. Cartman has historically been the character most likely to say cruel, offensive things to other people, often without any apparent awareness of how those comments land. Safe Space puts Cartman on the receiving end of exactly that kind of treatment, and then follows what happens when the adults around him respond not by addressing the comments directly, but by trying to remove Cartman's ability to see them at all. The specific mechanism the show uses for this is social media, and particularly the comment sections that had, by 2015, become a defining feature of how people interacted with images and posts online. Cartman posts a picture of himself, and the comments that follow are cruel, focusing on his weight in ways that are blunt and personal. Rather than addressing why people feel comfortable leaving this kind of comment in the first place, the adults around Cartman, including school staff influenced by PC Principal's broader cultural shift, decide that the solution is to create a filter, a system that will automatically remove negative comments before Cartman ever sees them, allowing him to post freely without ever encountering criticism. This setup allows the episode to introduce one of the most discussed characters from this entire season, a figure who appears to Cartman almost like a vision, dressed in a costume that gives him an almost superhero-like appearance, and who introduces himself using a single word as his name. This character, referred to simply as Reality, exists within the episode as a kind of embodiment of the thing Cartman is being protected from. He follows Cartman around, periodically appearing to deliver blunt, often harsh assessments of Cartman's situation, assessments that nobody else in the episode seems willing to offer. What makes Reality such a notable addition to the show's cast of characters, even though he appears in relatively few episodes overall, is how directly he functions as a kind of authorial voice. Throughout this video, we have discussed how South Park typically avoids stating its arguments directly, preferring instead to let arguments emerge through situations, contrasts, and character behavior rather than through any single character simply explaining what the audience is supposed to think. Reality represents something close to an exception to this pattern. His entire purpose within the world of the episode is to say things that are true but that nobody wants to hear, and to say them without any of the social cushioning that every other character in Cartman's life provides. Sources discussing this character have noted that his introduction coincided with broader cultural conversations happening at the time about celebrities and public figures who had become the subject of intense criticism, sometimes for their physical appearance, sometimes for their behavior, and how those public figures and their supporters often responded to that criticism. The episode includes references to specific incidents involving celebrities who had been shamed publicly for various reasons, and Reality's response to these situations is consistent. He does not argue that the criticism these figures received was deserved or fair in any moral sense. What he argues is that the criticism existed, that it was not going away simply because people wished it would, and that pretending otherwise did not actually help the people receiving it. This distinction is central to understanding what Safe Space is actually arguing, and it is a more careful argument than it might initially appear. The episode is not claiming that cruelty on social media is acceptable, or that the people leaving cruel comments about Cartman's weight are behaving well. What the episode is questioning is whether the response to that cruelty, building systems designed to filter it out entirely so that the person being criticized never has to encounter it, actually addresses the underlying situation in any meaningful way, or whether it simply creates a kind of bubble that leaves the person inside it less prepared for a world that does not operate the way the bubble does. Reality's most quoted line from the episode makes this point directly, drawing a comparison between the world Cartman is being protected within and the kind of environment associated with college campuses, places that, by 2015, had become associated in public discourse with debates over safe spaces, trigger warnings, and the question of how much protection from difficult ideas and criticism institutions should provide to the people within them. The line suggests that the world outside this protected bubble does not operate according to the same rules, and that learning to navigate criticism, rather than being shielded from it entirely, is part of what prepares someone to function in that larger world. The episode does not let this argument exist in a vacuum, however, and this is where Safe Space becomes more interesting than a simple statement about toughening up in the face of criticism. Cartman, even after being introduced to Reality and hearing these blunt assessments repeatedly, does not simply accept them and move on. He continues seeking out the comment filter, continues wanting to be protected from the things people are saying about him, even after being told, directly and repeatedly, that this protection is not actually solving anything. The episode treats this not as a moral failing unique to Cartman, but as something closer to a basic human impulse, the desire to avoid pain, even when avoiding that pain does not make the underlying source of it go away. This nuance matters because it prevents Safe Space from being read simply as an argument that people should just ignore criticism and toughen up, an argument that, stated that simply, would miss most of what is actually difficult about the situation the episode depicts. The episode acknowledges that the comments Cartman receives are genuinely cruel, genuinely hurtful, and genuinely unwanted. It does not ask Cartman or the audience to pretend otherwise. What it questions is whether the specific solution being proposed, an automated filter that removes the cruelty from view without addressing anything about why it exists or how Cartman might actually cope with it, represents a real solution or simply a postponement, one that leaves Cartman in exactly the same position the moment the filter fails or the moment he encounters criticism through some channel the filter does not cover. The episode connects this storyline back to the broader season arc involving PC Principal and the cultural shift his arrival represents, though the connection is handled with more subtlety than some of the season's more direct confrontation. The comment filter that Cartman is given is presented as part of a broader institutional response, one consistent with the kind of solutions that PC Principal and the culture around him tend to favor throughout the season. Solutions that address the visible symptoms of a problem through technological or administrative fixes, while leaving the underlying dynamics that produce the problem in the first place completely unexamined and unchanged. This pattern, addressing symptoms through administrative solutions while leaving causes untouched, recurs throughout the season in various forms, and Safe Space represents one of its clearest expressions. The cruelty on social media does not disappear because Cartman can no longer see it. It continues to exist, continues to be written, continues to be read by other people. The filter changes Cartman's experience without changing anything about the actual situation that experience was a response to. In this sense, the episode's argument extends beyond just Cartman's individual situation and toward a broader question about what it means to solve a problem versus what it means to simply make a problem invisible to the person most directly affected by it. The episode's reception reflected the broader split in how audiences responded to this season as a whole. Some viewers and commentators praised Safe Space as one of the season's sharpest entries, viewing reality as a memorable and effective device for making a point the show had been building toward across multiple episodes. A point about the difference between feeling protected and actually being equipped to handle a world that does not provide that protection by default. Other viewers found the episode's argument less compelling, particularly in how it handled the genuine harm caused by online harassment, suggesting that the episode's focus on Cartman's response to criticism risked minimizing the actual impact that sustained, targeted online cruelty can have on real people, a category of harm that the episode's framing through Cartman, a character the audience has spent years learning not to fully sympathize with, may have made easier to wave away than it would be in a more sympathetic context. This tension between an argument about resilience and self-sufficiency on one hand and a genuine acknowledgement of real harm on the other runs through Safe Space in a way that mirrors the tension this video identified in the earlier episode about a single racial slur. In both cases, the show seems aware that it is dealing with something genuinely harmful, something that cannot simply be dismissed as an overreaction, while simultaneously arguing that the response to that harm, whether an apology tour to a specific public figure or an automated filter removing all criticism from view, often ends up serving a different function than the one it claims to serve, becoming more about the appearance of addressing the problem than about anything that actually changes for the person affected by it. By the end of the episode, Cartman's situation has not been resolved in any clean way. He has not learned to ignore criticism. He has not stopped seeking protection from it. The filter, and the broader culture that produced it, remain in place, ready to be used again whenever similar situations arise. Reality, having delivered his message, departs without having fundamentally changed how Cartman or the town around him operates. This lack of resolution is consistent with how this video has described the show's approach throughout, an approach that tends to identify patterns and tensions without resolving them, trusting that the identification itself is the point, regardless of whether anyone within the story actually learns from it. What Safe Space adds to the larger argument of Season 19, and to the larger argument of this video, is a specific example of how the culture PC principle represents extends beyond questions of language and behavior policed by an authority figure, into questions of how information itself, including criticism, gets filtered, curated, and controlled before it ever reaches the person it concerns. PC principle beats Cartman for using a trigger word. The culture that produces PC principle also produces a comment filter that prevents Cartman from seeing what people actually think of him. Both are framed by the institutions implementing them as protective measures. Both, the show suggests, function primarily to manage appearances rather than to address anything real, leaving the underlying dynamics, whether casual cruelty toward a student with the wrong word or genuine criticism toward a person who has gained weight, completely intact, simply rerouted around the person most affected by them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Safe Space showed how protection from criticism can become its own kind of trap, leaving the underlying problem untouched. The next chapter follows the season toward its conclusion, where political correctness collides with an entirely different force, one the show frames as an even greater threat to the town than PC Principal himself. Section 8, When the Ads Became the Enemy. The final 3 episodes of South Park's 19th season form a single connected story, one that brings together nearly every thread the season had been developing since its premiere. Sponsored content, Truth in Advertising, and PC Principal Final Justice aired across November and December of 2015, and together they represent the season's attempt to answer a question it had been raising since its very first episode. If political correctness, as embodied by PC Principal and the culture surrounding him, has taken over South Park so completely, what happens next? Does the town simply continue living under this new culture indefinitely, or does something eventually come along that disrupts it? The answer the show provides is, on its surface, an unusual one. The threat that ultimately challenges PC Principal's hold on South Park is not a rival ideology, and it is not a character who pushes back against political correctness directly. The threat is advertising, specifically the kind of advertising that had become increasingly common online by 2015. Advertising that disguises itself as content, that follows people across the internet based on their browsing habits, and that, by the end of this storyline, the show depicts as having become something close to a living entity in its own right. Sponsored content opens with a storyline involving Jimmy Valmer, the school's student newspaper reporter, who finds himself in conflict with PC Principal over language used in an article. Jimmy, who has a physical disability and uses crutches, has built his identity around blunt, often crude humor, frequently making jokes about his own disability using language that other characters find shocking, specifically because of who is saying it. PC Principal, true to the character established in earlier episodes, objects to this language, setting up a conflict between Jimmy's journalistic voice and the school's new standards for acceptable speech. What makes this storyline notable is how it positions Jimmy relative to PC Principal's worldview. Jimmy is, in any reasonable sense, a member of a group that PC Principal's stated mission claims to protect. He has a disability. He has, in earlier seasons, been the subject of jokes from other characters about that disability. If PC Principal's culture is genuinely about protecting people like Jimmy from harmful language, Jimmy himself would seem to be exactly the kind of person that culture exists to defend. And yet Jimmy is the one being told that his own language he uses about his own life and his own disability, is unacceptable. This inversion, where the person a policy claims to protect becomes the person most restricted by that policy, recurs throughout this final stretch of episodes, and it represents one of the season's sharpest observations. PC Principal's culture does not actually ask the people it claims to protect what they want or how they feel about their own situations. It operates according to a predetermined set of rules about acceptable language, rules that apply regardless of who is speaking or in what context, and Jimmy's situation makes this gap visible in a way that earlier episodes, focused more on outside observers like Cartman or the boys, had not fully explored. Running alongside Jimmy's storyline is the disappearance of two students, Jimmy's colleague at the school paper and another student named Leslie. Their disappearance sets off a mystery that occupies much of truth in advertising, with the boys attempting to figure out what happened to them while being repeatedly distracted by advertising content that appears throughout the episode, pop-ups, sponsored articles, and clickbait headlines that pull their attention away from the actual investigation every time they get close to an answer. This structural choice, where the characters' attempts to solve a mystery are constantly derailed by advertising content, mirrors something the episode is arguing about: the broader media environment of the time. The mystery itself becomes almost secondary to the experience of trying to solve it, an experience defined by constant interruption, redirection, and distraction. Sources discussing this episode have noted that it was widely seen as one of the more disorienting entries in the show's history, with the plot deliberately resisting the kind of clear resolution that earlier episodes in the season had provided, a choice that some viewers found frustrating and others found to be an accurate reflection of what the episode was actually trying to depict. The reveal that ties this storyline together is that Leslie, the missing student, is not actually a student at all. She is an advertisement, one that has taken human form and integrated itself into the school, into the town, and into the lives of the people around her, gathering information and influence in ways that none of the human characters initially recognize. This reveal recontextualizes much of what has happened throughout the season, suggesting that the spread of PC Principal's culture, the increasing surveillance of language, the increasing pressure to conform to specific standards of speech and behavior has been happening alongside, and perhaps in service of, a different kind of spread entirely, one driven by advertising's increasing ability to embed itself into every aspect of daily life. PC Principal Final Justice, the season finale, brings these threads together in a sequence that several sources have described as among the most violent the show had produced up to that point. PC Principal, having traveled to a bar in a gentrified part of a major city in another country, is attacked by a group of patrons there and responds by killing every one of his attackers in a sequence the show plays with surprising intensity, a marked departure from the more comedic violence that had defined his introduction earlier in the season. This sequence is significant because of what it reveals about PC Principal's actual nature, beneath the fraternity aesthetics and the ideological language that had defined him up to this point. When pushed into a genuinely violent confrontation, PC Principal is shown to be extraordinarily capable of violence, more so than almost any other character the show has depicted in a similar situation. The show does not explain this capability, and it does not need to. The point is not where this capability came from, but what it suggests about the character underneath the persona, a persona built around language, sensitivity, and inclusion, sitting on top of something far more aggressive and far far more dangerous than that persona suggests. By the end of the finale, the threat posed by the sentient advertising is addressed, though sources describing the episode's reception have noted that this resolution was widely seen as one of the weaker aspects of the finale, with at least one major review describing the episode as a mixed bag in terms of how well it tied together everything the season had been building toward. The advertising threat, having been built up across 2 episodes as something genuinely dangerous, something that had infiltrated the town at every level, is resolved in a way that several critics found less satisfying than the build-up had promised. What happens to PC Principal himself, however, is more significant for the purposes of this video. Rather than being removed from the school, defeated, or otherwise written out of the show's ongoing storyline, PC Principal announces to the school that he intends to remain, continuing his mission to enforce political correctness while now also positioning himself as a defender against the advertising threat the season has just resolved. The character who began the season as the embodiment of a new and disruptive cultural force ends the season not by being undone, but by expanding his stated mission, absorbing a new threat into his existing framework, and continuing on largely unchanged. This ending matters enormously for how this video has been framing the entire PC Principal storyline. Throughout this season, the show has repeatedly suggested that PC Principal's culture, once established, becomes self-sustaining, maintained not just by PC Principal himself, but by the town around him, which has internalized his expectations to the point where his direct enforcement becomes less necessary over time. The finale's ending extends this idea one step further. Even when a new, seemingly larger threat emerges, one that might have provided an opportunity for the town to reassess the culture PC Principal has built, that culture simply absorbs the new threat into itself, framing the response to advertising in the same language and through the same institutions that have governed everything else throughout the season. Looking at this 3-episode arc as a whole, what emerges is less a story about political correctness being challenged or defeated by some outside force, and more a story about how thoroughly a particular cultural framework, once established, can absorb almost anything thrown at it, including threats that have nothing to do with the framework's original purpose. The sentient advertising storyline could, in a different season, have been an entirely separate satirical target, addressing concerns about online advertising, data collection, and media manipulation on its own terms. Instead, by folding this storyline into the season's existing PC Principal arc, the show suggests that these concerns, however legitimate on their own, become subordinated to and processed through whatever the dominant cultural framework happens to be at the time, regardless of whether that framework is actually equipped to address them. This connects back to one of the central tensions this video has been tracing since its earliest section: the gap between what institutions claim to be addressing and what they actually end up doing in practice. PC Principal's stated mission at the start of the season was addressing racism and bias at South Park Elementary. By the end of the season, his stated mission has expanded to include defending the town from sentient advertising, a threat that has essentially nothing to do with his original mandate. What has remained constant throughout this expansion is not the substance of what PC Principal is addressing, but his methods, his authority, and his position within the town's institutions. The mission changes. The structure built to address that mission does not. For viewers watching this season as it aired, the ending likely felt, in some ways, anticlimactic. PC Principal is not defeated. The culture he represents is not dismantled or even seriously challenged. The town does not return to how it was before his arrival. Instead, everything simply continues, with PC Principal's role expanding rather than contracting, and with the town having fully absorbed, by this point, the expectations and behaviors that his arrival introduced at the start of the season. Whether this ending represents the show making a deliberate point about how cultural shifts of this kind tend to entrench themselves rather than reverse, or simply represents a season finale that, as some critics noted, struggled to tie its many threads together into a satisfying conclusion, is a question that does not have a single clear answer, and one that reflects the broader difficulty of analyzing this season as either a fully successful satirical statement or a more uneven creative experiment that did not always land the way its individual pieces suggested it might. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The season ended not with PC Principal's culture being challenged, but with it expanding to absorb an entirely new threat. The next chapter steps back from this single season to look at the two characters who have represented opposite poles of this argument since the show's earliest years, and what their ongoing disagreement reveals about where the show itself actually stands. Section 9. Cartman, Kyle, and the question of who is right. Across every episode covered so far in this video, two characters have appeared again and again, often on opposite sides of whatever conflict the episode is built around. Eric Cartman and Kyle Broflovsky have been part of South Park since its very first episode, and over more than 2 decades, their relationship has become one of the show's most consistent structural structural elements, a kind of permanent disagreement that the show returns to whenever it wants to explore questions of right and wrong, fairness, and how people justify their own behavior. Understanding how this relationship works is essential to understanding what South Park actually believes about political correctness, because Cartman and Kyle have functioned, across the show's history, as something close to opposing arguments given permanent form. Cartman is selfish, manipulative, frequently cruel, and almost never shows genuine remorse for the harm he causes others. Kyle is, by comparison, the character most likely to object when something is unfair, the character most likely to point out when someone, often Cartman, is behaving in a way that hurts other people. If the show were simply taking sides in an ongoing debate, Kyle would seem like the obvious character to align with, the voice of reason against Cartman's chaos. But the relationship between these two characters has never been this simple, and looking at how the show has used them across the episodes already discussed in this video reveals something more complicated about where the show's sympathies actually lie, and how those sympathies shift depending on the specific situation rather than remaining fixed to either character permanently. In With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, the episode covered earlier in this video that deals with Randy's use of a racial slur on national television, Kyle is barely involved in the main storyline at all. The central conflict involves Stan and Token, with Stan attempting to minimize what his father said and Token refusing to accept that minimization. Cartman appears in this episode primarily through the subplot involving the substitute teacher with dwarfism, a subplot where Cartman's behavior is, by any reasonable standard, simply cruel, with no redeeming complexity to it. The episode does not ask viewers to find anything sympathetic in Cartman's treatment of this character. It is presented as straightforwardly wrong, and the episode does not complicate that judgment in any way. This matters because it establishes something important: the show's willingness to mock political correctness, to question whether certain reactions are proportionate, to explore the gap between performative offense and genuine harm, does not extend to a blanket defense of saying or doing whatever someone wants regardless of impact. Cartman's cruelty toward the substitute teacher is not framed as an example of free speech being unfairly restricted. It is framed as someone being needlessly cruel to another person, full stop. The show is capable of holding both ideas at once, that some reactions to offensive speech can be disproportionate, and that some speech is simply cruel regardless of how anyone reacts to it. The PC Principal storyline complicates this picture further, because it introduces a character whose methods are, in some ways, similar to Cartman's own historical behavior, just redirected toward different targets and justified through different language. Cartman has spent the show's entire run using whatever justification is available to excuse cruel behavior, sometimes claiming victimhood himself, sometimes claiming that his actions serve some larger purpose, sometimes simply not bothering to justify himself at all. PC Principal, in his introduction, uses violence to enforce his vision of acceptable behavior, justifying that violence through language about reducing harm and increasing sensitivity. When Cartman becomes one of PC Principal's targets, specifically in the bathroom assault that this video discussed in an earlier section, something interesting happens to how the audience is positioned. Cartman, throughout the show's history, has rarely been a character audiences are asked to sympathize with when he suffers consequences for his own behavior. His schemes typically backfire in ways that feel deserved, even when the backfire itself is exaggerated or absurd. But the violence PC Principal inflicts on Cartman in this episode is depicted with a severity that does not feel like the show's usual cartoonish comeuppance. It feels instead like something has gone genuinely wrong, that the response has become disproportionate to anything Cartman actually did, even accounting for the fact that what Cartman did was, as usual, an attempt to cause harm to someone else. This creates a strange situation where Cartman, a character the show has spent years training audiences not to sympathize with, becomes, for at least this one sequence, someone the audience is positioned to feel something for, not because his own behavior has changed or improved, but because the response to that behavior has become so disproportionate that it shifts the moral weight of the scene entirely. The show is not asking viewers to suddenly see Cartman as a good person. It is asking viewers to notice that even someone like Cartman, someone whose behavior genuinely deserves consequences, can become a sympathetic figure if the consequences themselves become severe enough and disconnected enough from any reasonable sense of proportion. Kyle's role across the PC Principal season is more complicated than his role in earlier episodes covered in this video, partly because the season's serialized structure gives him less of the kind of standalone moral clarity that earlier episodes, built around single self-contained stories, often provided him. Kyle does not emerge across this season as a clear voice of opposition to PC Principal's culture, nor does he emerge as someone who embraces that culture fully. He largely exists within it, navigating it the way most of the town's residents do, occasionally expressing discomfort, but rarely positioned as the character through whom the show's strongest objections are voiced. This is a notable notable departure from how Kyle has often functioned in earlier seasons, where his objections frequently served as the moment where the show's actual argument became clearest. The point in the episode where a character finally said, in plain terms, what the episode had been building toward. The PC Principal season largely reassigns this function to other characters, most notably Reality in the Safe Space episode covered earlier in this video, a character who exists entirely outside the show's regular cast, and who therefore carries none of the history or established relationships that would complicate how his statements land. This reassignment is worth considering carefully because it suggests something about how the show's writers may have been thinking about this particular subject differently than they had thought about earlier subjects covered in this video. In episodes like With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, the show's argument emerges through the relationship between established characters, Stan and Token, whose history and dynamic give weight to their conversation in a way that would not exist if either of them were a new character introduced for a single episode. The PC Principal season, by contrast, often relies on characters and situations that exist somewhat outside the show's established relationships, using outside figures like Reality, or using PC Principal himself, a character introduced specifically for this storyline, to carry arguments that, in earlier seasons, might have been carried by the tension between characters the audience had known for years. Whether this represents a deliberate choice or simply a consequence of the season's different structure is difficult to say with certainty, but the effect is noticeable. The PC Principal season feels, in some ways, less personal than episodes like With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, where the conflict between Stan and Token carries an emotional weight built on years of established friendship. PC Principal's conflicts, even the violent ones, exist at a kind of remove, more about ideas and systems than about specific relationships between characters the audience has come to know over time. This difference connects back to a question this video raised earlier, when discussing the gap between episodes that deal with specific, individual harm, like the impact of a racial slur on a specific friendship, and episodes that deal with broader cultural patterns, like the spread of performative outrage across an entire town. The episodes that focus on individual relationships, Stan and Token, Cartman and the substitute teacher, tend to produce clearer moral positions, because the show is dealing with specific people and specific harms that can be evaluated on their own terms. The episodes that focus on broader cultural patterns, including most of the PC Principal season, tend to produce more ambiguous positions, because the show is dealing with systems and trends that affect everyone differently and that do not reduce easily to a single relationship between two characters. Cartman and Kyle's ongoing relationship across the entire history of the show has always worked best as a way of testing specific situations rather than as a permanent statement about which character represents the show's values. Kyle is right when he objects to genuine cruelty, as he often does across the show's history. Cartman is, in some narrow sense, sympathetic when the consequences he faces become disproportionate to what he actually did, even though Cartman himself remains, in almost every other respect, exactly the kind of character whose behavior would normally deserve consequences. The show does not resolve this into a single consistent position about either character, and it does not need to, because the relationship between them has never been about determining who is right in some permanent sense. It has been about using two characters with very different relationships to honesty, cruelty, and self-justification to test specific situations as they arise. Situations that the PC Principal season, with its focus on systems and culture rather than individual relationships, often does not provide in quite the same way the show's earlier, more self-contained episodes did. What this means for the larger argument of this video is that South Park's position on political correctness cannot be reduced to either character's perspective alone. It is not simply Cartman's perspective that any restriction on speech or behavior is unjustified regardless of the harm that speech or behavior might cause. Cartman's cruelty toward the substitute teacher is not vindicated by anything else in the show, and it is not simply Kyle's perspective either, to the extent that Kyle has a single consistent perspective at all across more than 2 decades of episodes, since Kyle's role has shifted significantly depending on the specific story being told. What emerges instead is something closer to a set of recurring questions applied to different situations with different characters, producing different answers depending on the specific people and specific harms involved, rather than a single fixed position that could be summarized in one sentence and applied uniformly to every episode this video has covered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartman and Kyle have spent decades testing different situations without ever settling into a single fixed position. The final chapter looks at how this argument has continued into the show's more recent seasons, and what nearly 30 years of this ongoing conflict says about why South Park has remained relevant for so long. Section 10. The argument that never ended. By the time South Park reached its later seasons, the conversation around political correctness had changed dramatically from what it had been when PC Principal first walked through the doors of South Park Elementary. Terms that had been relatively new in 2015 had become part of everyday language by the early 2020s. The specific cultural moment that PC Principal had been built to satirize, the rise of campus activism, the language of safe spaces and trigger warning, the frat bro aesthetic layered over progressive rhetoric, had itself evolved into something different, broader, and in many ways more entrenched in mainstream institutions than it had been when the season 19 storyline first introduced these ideas to the show's audience. What is striking, looking at the show's output in the years since, is that South Park did not simply move on from this subject once the cultural moment that inspired PC Principal had passed. Instead, the show's engagement with questions of language, sensitivity, and institutional caution became, if anything, more frequent, woven into episodes covering an enormous range of other subjects, from the COVID pandemic to streaming services to the show's own declining viewership among younger audiences. Political correctness, as a subject, stopped being something the show addressed in a dedicated storyline and became something closer to background texture, a constant presence in the world the show depicts, the way weather or traffic might be a constant presence in any other television show set in a real place. This shift is worth examining closely because it represents a kind of maturation in how the show approaches this subject, one that connects back to everything this video has covered across the previous 9 sections. The earlier episodes covered in this video, the tolerance camp, the episode about a single racial slur, the early episodes about performative outrage, all of these treated political correctness, or behaviors that would later be described using that term, as something notable, something worth building an entire episode around because of how unusual or extreme it seemed at the time. By the time the show reaches its more recent seasons, these same behaviors are no longer treated as unusual. They are simply how the world works now, within the show's fictional version of South Park, and the show's characters navigate this reality the way people might navigate any other unremarkable feature of daily life, with occasional friction, occasional complaints, but mostly just acceptance. One of the clearest examples of this shift comes from the show's handling of its own declining cultural position. In episodes from more recent seasons, characters within the show have openly commented on the idea that South Park itself sucks now, a phrase used by Stan in more than one episode to describe his frustration with how the town, and by extension the show itself, has changed. This kind of self-aware commentary, where the show seems to be acknowledging criticisms that real-world viewers and critics have made about its recent output, represents a continuation of something this video identified much earlier: the show's long-standing interest in examining reactions to itself, not just reactions to the world around it. What makes this self-commentary relevant to the subject of political correctness specifically is how often these moments of self-criticism get tied, within the show's fictional world, to the same cultural shifts that PC Principal's arrival represented back in season 19. When Stan complains that South Park sucks now, the show frequently frames this complaint within a town that has become almost entirely defined by its relationship to broader political and cultural conversations. Conversations about sensitivity, about appropriate language, about which jokes are still considered acceptable and which are not. The show, in other words, has continued to use its fictional town as a kind of laboratory for examining how a community absorbs and lives with cultural change, the same function it served in episodes like The Death Camp of Tolerance more than 20 years earlier, just applied now to a town that has had decades longer to adapt to the kinds of pressures that episode first introduced. This continuity matters because it pushes back against a reading of South Park's relationship with political correctness that might otherwise seem tempting. The idea that the show simply opposes political correctness as a fixed position, that every episode covered in this video is ultimately making the same argument, that sensitivity has gone too far and that the show exists to push back against it. If this were the show's actual position, one might expect the show's engagement with this subject to have peaked around the time of the PC Principal storyline and then faded, as the specific cultural moment that inspired that storyline became less novel and more normalized. Instead, the show's engagement with these questions has continued, adapting to new situations, new technologies, and new institutions, without ever settling into a simple, fixed argument that could be stated once and then repeated indefinitely. What has remained consistent across nearly 30 years and the enormous range of episodes this video has discussed is not a position on political correctness specifically, but a method, a way of approaching subjects that the show applies regardless of what those subjects happen to be at any given moment. This method involves taking something that exists in the real world, often something that has already generated significant public conversation on its own, and placing it within the specific, exaggerated, but internally consistent world of South Park, a town small enough that cultural shifts can be observed affecting everyone, large enough that those shifts can can play out across multiple characters and storylines, and populated by characters whose established personalities and relationships give the show a kind of baseline against which any new development can be measured. This method is what allowed the show to take a phrase like stunning and brave, used in real-world media coverage with what some viewers felt was excessive frequency, and turn it into a recurring joke that revealed something about how language can become detached from its original meaning through repetition. It is what allowed the show to take the concept of a safe space, a term that had become loaded with political meaning in real-world discourse, and place it within a storyline about Cartman and social media, stripping away some of the political baggage the term carried in order to examine the underlying question of what protection from criticism actually accomplishes. And it is what has allowed the show in its more recent seasons to continue examining questions of language, sensitivity, and institutional response without needing to introduce a character as explicitly symbolic as PC Principal, because the groundwork laid by that character and by everything that came before him has become part of the show's ongoing world, something that does not need to be reintroduced or re-explained every time it becomes relevant to a new storyline. Looking back across everything this video has covered, from the earliest episodes built around crude paper cutout animation to the most recent seasons grappling with a town that some of its own characters openly describe as having lost something, a pattern emerges that goes beyond any single episode or storyline. South Park has never been a show that argues sensitivity is bad, or that nothing should ever be off limits, or that people who feel hurt by something are simply wrong to feel that way. What the show has consistently done, across decades and across an enormous range of subjects, is ask what happens to a community once it organizes itself around managing how things look and sound, rather than around the underlying realities those appearances and sounds are supposed to represent. This question appears in the tolerance camp, where adults perform acceptance of Mr. Garrison's behavior without ever actually engaging with him as a person. It appears in the episode about Randy's use of a racial slur, where an apology to a single public figure is treated as resolving a harm that figure had nothing to do with, while the actual person harmed, Token, is left to work through his feelings on his own, outside any institutional process at all. It appears in the early episodes about performative outrage, where reactions to minor incidents take on lives of their own, disconnected from whatever those reactions were supposedly about. It appears, most explicitly, in PC Principal himself, a character whose entire identity is built around the gap between the language he uses and the methods he actually employs. And it appears in Safe Space, where a filter designed to protect Cartman from criticism does nothing to address why that criticism exists in the first place, simply rerouting it around the person it was directed at. In every one of these cases, the show identifies something that functions as a kind of substitute, a system, a phrase, a gesture, a piece of technology that stands in for genuine engagement with a real situation, while allowing everyone involved to feel as though the situation has been addressed. And in every one of these cases, the show suggests, without ever stating it as directly as this summary might, that these substitutes tend to become more important, more visible, and more consequential than whatever they were originally meant to address, eventually taking on a kind of independent existence that has little to do with the people or problems that originally motivated them. This is, in the end, a more specific and more interesting argument than simply opposing political correctness as a general concept, and it helps explain why South Park has remained relevant across nearly 30 years, spanning a period during which the specific cultural conversations the show has engaged with have changed dramatically, multiple times over. A show built around the simple position that sensitivity has gone too far would have had to keep finding new examples of sensitivity going too far, examples that would inevitably become repetitive over time, telling essentially the same joke with different specific detail. A show built around the more specific observation this video has identified about the gap between addressing problems and managing the appearance of having addressed them has a much wider range of material to draw from, because that gap can appear in essentially any institution, any community, and any era, regardless of what specific language or technology happens to be involved at any given moment. It is worth returning, in this final section, to the controversy this video covered earlier, the episodes that became permanently unavailable following threats connected to their depiction of a religious figure. This video raised a question at the time about how to understand that situation, whether it represented political correctness winning in some meaningful sense, or whether it represented something categorically different, a response to a genuine threat of violence rather than a response to ideas. Having now covered the full range of material in this video, it may be possible to say something more about this question, though not necessarily to answer it definitively. What connects that situation to everything else in this video is not the specific subject involved, but the same underlying pattern this video has identified repeatedly. A network, faced with a situation involving genuine risk, responded not by by engaging with the underlying issue directly, but by managing its appearance, removing the content entirely, censoring not just the specific element that generated the threat, but also material that had nothing to do with that threat, and ultimately making the entire situation permanently invisible rather than addressing it in any other way. Whether this response was justified, given the genuine danger involved, is a different question from whether this response followed the same basic pattern this video has identified in nearly every other situation covered. A pattern of managing visibility rather than addressing substance. A pattern that, in this case, happened to be applied to a situation where the stakes were considerably higher than in any of the other examples this video has discussed. This connection does not resolve the tension this video identified earlier. If anything, it deepens it. The pattern this video has identified, the substitution of appearance management for genuine engagement, is something South Park has spent decades satirizing, often with real insight into how that pattern functions and what it costs the people caught within it. And yet that same pattern, when it was applied to South Park itself, in response to a threat that the show's creators had no control over and could not simply satirize their way out of, produced an outcome that the show has never been able to address in the same way it addresses everything else. The show that built an entire creative identity around refusing to let anything be managed out of existence found itself, in this one specific case, on the receiving end of exactly that kind of management, with no satirical response available that could change the underlying situation. This is not a comfortable place to end, and this video will not pretend it is, but it may be the most honest place to end, given everything this video has covered. South Park's relationship with political correctness has never been a simple story of a show fighting against a force and winning, or losing, in any clean sense. It has been a long series of observations made across decades about how communities, institutions, and individuals respond to discomfort, to criticism, to the presence of ideas and language that some people find difficult or offensive. Sometimes those observations have been sharp and have aged well. Sometimes they have been messier, generating real disagreement about whether the show was making a fair point or missing something important. And at least once, the show's own attempt to make one of these observations ran directly into a situation that the show's usual methods could not resolve, leaving behind a gap in its own history that remains, to this day, exactly that, a gap rather than a punchline. What ties all of this together, across nearly 30 years and the enormous range of episodes this video has discussed, is not a conclusion that can be stated neatly, but a way of looking at the world that the show has applied consistently, even when the results of applying it have been uneven, uncomfortable, or unresolved. South Park has spent decades asking what happens when communities decide that managing how something looks matters more than addressing what it actually is. Sometimes the answer is funny, sometimes it is uncomfortable, and at least once, the answer became part of the show's own history in a way nothing else ever has, a permanent absence sitting alongside everything else the show has produced, a reminder that the patterns this show has spent decades examining in other people, other institutions, and other communities do not stop at the edge of the screen, and can, under the right circumstances, reach all the way back to the people making the show itself. Nearly 30 years after two film students sent a crude animated short as a Christmas card joke, the basic question that short film raised, what happens when something considered untouchable gets touched anyway, remains, in one form or another, the question this show has never stopped asking. The specific subjects have changed, the specific language has changed, the specific institutions and movements the show has examined have come and gone, replaced by new ones, which will themselves eventually be replaced by others still. But the underlying interest, in the gap between what people say they are doing and what they are actually doing, in the difference between addressing a problem and managing how that problem appears, has remained constant, running through every episode this video has covered, from a black and white concentration camp parody, to a fraternity of politically correct enforcers, to a filter designed to remove criticism from a teenager's social media feed. Whatever comes next, for South Park and for the broader cultural conversations it continues to draw from, this underlying interest seems unlikely to disappear, because the gap it identifies between appearance and substance, between managing how something looks and addressing what it actually is, does not appear to be going away either, no matter how much the specific language used to describe it continues to change. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.